More minutes. Let me just. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. New year to all of you. Typically I say Happy New Year, but I've been getting some mixed responses on that. So I'll cut out the happy and just say New Year. It is indeed a new year. And we're excited to welcome you to the University of Michigan's Engineering Education Research Program Seminar Series, as we have our first speaker of the year 2022, Dr. Brooke Coley. And so we welcome you. Please visit the website to see the remaining speakers. Because if you come before, we're glad to have you back. If it's your first time, welcome. We'd love to see you again, allow you to see us, but the format may takes place. I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed speaker this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. And so typically, you know, when you do intros, you read the bio or the intro that the speaker has presented. But I just felt, you know, given our personal relationship and also just the constraints on the academy and how we are trained to talk about our skill set, talk about who we are, is often very limiting. And so, you know, Dr. Brooke Coley, I consider her a sister from another mister. We've only known each other directly for a couple years, but it seemed like we've known each other all our lives. And just a very quick way we've been able to vibe and correlate our research interests, our personal lives, and things like that. And so she's very much a sister and feel very much kinship. But also she's a sister, right? You know, her Blackness is all over her, not only visually, but, you know, from a political, social, cultural, spiritual perspective. She exemplifies the best of Blackness. And so I thoroughly appreciate about how she brings that to her research and professionalism, but also who she is as a person, as a citizen, as a Black American. But Brooke also is a wonderful mother. If you know anything about Brooke, you know she loves her son, right? And so I grew up in a single mother home, and my mom spent a lot of time at work. And so anybody in the academy knows it takes a lot of time and energy out of you. And Brooke doesn't sacrifice that to love on her child, nor other people's children, right? And so, you know, I respect that about her. She's a mother scholar. She very much prioritizes her son's academic, emotional, holistic enrichment. And also she loves her parents, and they love on her. Yeah, I've been able to witness that too. So Brooke is many things. She's wonderful. There's a lot of you know, awards and accomplishments that you can read about and Google about her. But, you know, in addition to that, she's a people person. And I think that, you know, one thing I've noticed from my relationship with her is that she's trying to make engineering great for the first time, right? I mean, she really is concerned about the holistic individuals as well as the community of engineers and their influence on society, and how we can help folks be better people, right? And so that is why I'm very much excited for her talk today. Anytime she talks, anytime we're able to communicate, is a very stimulating, intellectually generative time. And so I hope that you're able to take notes, pay attention, that, you know, I know you'll gather something useful from our this presentation today, and I'm glad to have you with us. Now I turn it over to Brooke.
All right, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wow, thank you, Brother James. What an introduction, and I'm most appreciative. I think very seldom do you have the opportunity to see work come full circle and build relationships that are just will be lifelong. And so to have James introduce me, as he said, following the celebration of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., it's with great honor that I'm here today. And so I hope that I can do due diligence to the words that James has shared. This morning, I'm going to share with you a talk that is both very timely and significant. And it's entitled Navigating at the Intersection of Two Pandemics, exploring Black engineering graduate students' simultaneous experience of COVID-19 and Racism 20. And I'm hoping that this is informal. I will be intentional to save some space for questions at the end, but there will be some engagement along the way. So I won't just talk and have you sitting there idle. All right. So I'd first like to start by acknowledging that I am currently on the ancestral and unceded traditional territories of the Uadam and Muskoki Indian nations. I'm also indebted to the labor and sacrifice of the enslaved Africans and their descendants, whose blood, sweat, and tears nourished the soil of this country. So today I acknowledge them as the past, present, and future keepers of this land. Without them, I would not be able to be here, do this work, present to you. And just to give you a little background of my research foci, I try to coin it now as focusing on racial equity and justice with a specific attention to graduate student experiences. And I think about that in terms of different prongs, if you will. So there's talent development and pathways. And so I've tried to show some of the collaborations or funded work in these spaces. So in terms of talent development and pathways, I've had a grant with Nadia Kellum, who's also at ASU, and we were focusing on community college students as in untapped potential, right? So how we can think about community college students, most of the work looks at community college students once they transition or transfer into a four-year institution. But there's very little work that speaks to what informs their trajectories. Where are they receiving information from and what's influential? And so we've had a grant to focus on that and have some work coming out in that space. I also have a collaboration with Denise Simmons, where we have started the first engineering education REU engaged, which is a joint effort between ASU and the University of Florida. So thinking about, in engineering education, we tend to, it's an odd time to recruit people to the field. It's still relatively nascent. And we have a lot of students that don't even know that engineering education is a discipline. And so this REU is intentional to create and introduce this as a viable pathway to students in a proactive way where they could actually inform their trajectory. So we're 1 year into that, and we'll have our second summer coming up shortly. Also, I have thinking about faculty and Black student dynamics. So I have a new core grant with my co-PIs, Dr. Jennifer Becky and Dr. Carrie Wilkins-Yell. And we are trying to think about how the communication and connection happens between faculty and students. And I'll get into that a little bit in this talk because it's sort of overlapping. But specifically, what is it that students need? And what is it that faculty are given? And this is a study focused on Black STEM students nationally and how we can better align, leverage the lived experience to inform faculty competence, what those competencies should be, and how we can develop those competencies. You might know this guy down here at the right. This is Dr. James Holly Jr. We work together thinking about the macro level structures, the institutional policies, how racism is perpetuated institutionally and systematically. We recently presented a workshop at FIE, and we have some work where we're trying to think about moving beyond words and promises to action, and how we can inform institutions of what that responsibility is and what it looks like, and make a greater awareness of what the experience of Black students, faculty, and staff are on the other side of that. And then also I do work in cultivating anti-racist environments. And so that's using virtual reality. And so my co-PI there is Dr. Sharnia Artis, who's actually at George Mason. Sorry, that's a typo. And in cultivating anti-racist environments, we're thinking about how we can leverage the experiences of those students that are marginalized in engineering, using the actual lived experience from data collection that we gather through focus groups, interviews, those types of things, to actually design immersive experiences that faculty experience to see what it's like navigating. They basically take a walk in the shoes of marginalized students. And it creates an added dimension of visceral experience that impacts their ability to empathize. And it's based on a theory of embodied cognition. So because their body is feeling this experience, it makes their body throughout adopt behaviors that align with the experience. And I can talk a little bit more about that at the end if we have time. Today's talk is going to focus on one of my current grants, which is on the lived experience of Black graduate students in engineering specifically. And so we will get into that in just a second. But before we do, hopefully, Robin, that's been enough time. She's helping me here with some polls. So it should pop up in your poll. So question 1 is, since January 2020, how many pandemics have you experienced? And so I'll give you a second to answer that.
I didn't realize all of the questions were going to show up in one poll. I think we could probably just tell them to stop answering after number 1, though. Sorry about that.
Well, you know, I don't know if we do that, if it will allow you to see the results. So maybe everybody can just answer all 3, and then we can look at the results when they are populated, if that works.
Yep, and I'm sorry about that.
No problem, no problem. So I'll just read them. So question 1 is, how many pandemics have you experienced? Question 2 is, how often in meetings have you been or were you redirected to address non-research work? And then question 3 is, in your role, and that could be as student, as faculty, as staff, or any role, in your role at your institution, in terms of fostering anti-racist work, which would you consider yourself? Would you be a change agent? Are you change willing? Are you change indifferent? Are you change averse? So if you could just take a second and answer those 3, and then we'll wait to see the results get populated. So Robin, are you able to see the percentage of people?
I am. Shall I end the poll so everybody can see it? Or are you able to see it, Brooke?
I can't see it yet. I just see still the questions.
Okay, almost everyone has answered. I'm going to go ahead and end and share.
Okay, great. All right, great. Thank you so much for doing that, Robin. So
yeah, of course.
When we look at question 1 here, we see that this was, how many pandemics have you experienced? And 65% of our audience here today says 1, 18% say 2, and then 18% say more than 2. This is, oh, it says panelists couldn't answer. I'm sorry. So maybe these numbers might be slightly off, but it's a good way for us to just get a gauge. And I think what's most interesting to take away from this is that it's not binary, right? We all have a different interpretation of how many pandemics we experienced, right? So let's take that away from that question. When we look at question 2, how often in meetings are you redirected to address non-research work? And some 6% says very often, 65% says frequently, rarely 24%, and never 6%, okay? So again, there's a variation in how our research meetings might be redirected to address other topics. And this is, to note here is, I didn't say to deviate in a specific way. I just said, is there any redirection that happens? So that what's causing that redirection could be vague or different. So we'll talk about that as well. And lastly, in your role at your institution, in terms of fostering anti-racist work, which would you consider yourself? And so I gave 4 different options. And someone might ask, well, what's the difference between being a change agent and change willing, or change indifferent and change averse? I'd ask that you, if you have that question, hold throughout the presentation and we will revisit it. But I think it will become clear through the narratives of the members whose stories I will share with you today, what those differences are. So with that, thank you very much for answering those questions, and then we'll move on. So now I'm going to ask you one more question, I promise, and then I'll actually give something to you and talk. But if the National Science Foundation, and we won't take 3 minutes to do this, I just hope that some things could pop up in the chat, any ideas that you would have in terms of this. So the National Science Foundation has emailed you specifically with an opportunity to obtain funding to pursue a grand challenge for engineering education. What do you list as the top 3 challenges facing the field? So this could be anything. In your mind today, what are the three of the most critical challenges that we face in engineering education? And if anybody has an idea, just pop it in the chat. Diversity of design ideas. Okay, thank you for that. Lack of access, thank you. Mitigating racism, absolutely. Helping students design for the future. Okay, being a good ancestor, great. Using research and teaching, yes. Closing that, research to practice gap, right? Okay, any more that anybody cares to share? These are all great. Equitable access to prerequisite courses, not respecting the background that students bring. Thank you for that. Culture in academia, yes. Inclusion and equity, okay, great. So you all are well aware of some of the things that I also consider to be some of the critical issues. And this work today is going to speak to one of those specifically. So this figure here is to think about, when we think about graduate school, when we think about higher education, when we think about academia, there are several things that tend to add pressure. Publishing, the competitive landscape, the lack of financial security, or potentially the lack of job security in the time that we're in. There's been a lot of stability and instability. These are things that are shared across, right? These are not unique to any particular group. Now, there's a study that was done by a faculty at UC Berkeley, and they came out with this chart that sort of thought about mental health during your PhD. And the reason I'm starting here is because mental health is in fact one of the leading issues impacting graduate students, particularly in engineering. And if we think about mental health at the intersection of also experiencing marginalization, then we can get into a really complex territory. So when we look at this, I just want to highlight a few things, particularly that will uniquely speak to the group that I'm going to talk about today. And so creating a community, right? So a PhD can be very isolating. Now, this is not unique to marginalized students. This is just speaking in terms of graduate students in general. Dignity and respect. Now here, this is thinking about sexual misconduct. That's one interpretation of dignity and respect. In terms of the group that I will speak about today, we think about dignity and respect a little bit different in terms of being respected as a person, being seen as a professional and not just as labor. these ideals. Diversity, we think about role models. For the group that I'm going to speak about today, we know that there is a lacking diversity in the faculty and the staff, and this is of Black engineering students, and tailored support. So tailored support means customized to the needs of the group or the individual. So there are a lot of things here that impact all graduate students that are exacerbated in terms of Black graduate students. And so why does this matter? Well, mental health, depression, suicidal ideations, this has been on the increase even before pandemic 1 or pandemic 2. We had the shift to remote learning. COVID-19 made it very hard. It induced a hopelessness that made it hard for people to think about the future. There were added concerns about personal safety and security that could have added to anxieties that were already existing or created anxieties where there were none. And it was more difficult to access mental health support at a time where people actually needed it more. So this is important, again, as we think about this particular group. Now, when we add the dimension of being Black as a graduate student, we have some other things that we have to think about. So historically, Black engineering doctoral students face daily challenges, both in their academic and non-academic lives. They have a duality of being Black in the world and also being Black in their academic environments. This has been known to foster invisibility and hypervisibility, racialized experiences that are associated with psychological distress. Enduring such over a long period of time can lead to racial battle fatigue. And the support to offset these typically can come from having people with shared identity that you can share in your experience and have some type of identity related support that's not always available when less than 2% of the faculty share that identity. And so professional role models, mentors, and supports, as I said, STEM altogether, only 6% of the faculty in the US are Black. So taking all these things together, 604 days ago, we experienced the horrific murder of George Floyd. It's hard to believe that, that much time has already passed. But when we ask Black graduate students who were pursuing engineering as a Black graduate student, so we know that the pursuit of graduate school is something in itself. We've seen that. We've seen some of the challenges around mental health that results. Then if we add COVID-19, we know that that had impacts on depression and anxiety. But for this particular group, there was also an added realm, which triggered by the George Floyd injustice, we started to coin that time as racism 20, or basically a national attention to overt and systemic racism that had been enduring for quite some time. It was just that this one incident made it so visible, the world now gave it a stage, a conversation, a platform. So this work is an NSF-funded study, as I mentioned, and this is my co-PI, Jeremy London. She's at Virginia Tech. And the space team, so these are my grad students and postdoc here pictured. Without them, this work would be very difficult to do. They've been really entrenched in the work. We've built rapport with Black graduate students, and we now have a community that it's both powerful, empowering, necessary, and unfortunate that there aren't more spaces or opportunities for students to have such spaces, but I'll talk more about that. Our research question specifically was, what are the unique experiences of Black engineering graduate students simultaneously experiencing two pandemics? So our two pandemics being COVID-19 and racism 20. When you see this picture, typically I'll ask what people are seeing here. And the reason that I use this feature is not to highlight the men. It's not to highlight anything about their specific identity. What it is to show that when many people come together, or when many people have a shared identity, a shared experience, that can foster solidarity. And I want to anchor that because this work is grounded in kinship and solidarity. And then we also use the cultural historical activity theory to situate this work. Kinship and solidarity enables us to think about the community, Black graduate students as a community with a shared experience because of their indelible mark of race. Chat enables us to think about the institution and its actors and how that can be conceptualized in pursuit of a common goal. Here, the common goal is to cultivate an inclusive or anti-racist environment. This just is a model that shows how the chat interacts. And so you think about having subjects, objectives, rules, community, and divisions of labor. And what's more so important is thinking about all these interconnections and actually taking pieces of this system and really investigating it, synthesizing it, and seeking to understand the components as dyads and then collectively as a system. And in a sense, to sort of see where the breakdowns are that prevent the system from achieving its goal. So the methodology for my study specifically, we take the intersection of using interpretive phenomenology because we're very interested in that lived experience of being Black as a graduate student, Black and a graduate student, and navigating at this time. We've also positioned this to be community-based participatory research because our group here are the Black graduate students, and they are co-creating the knowledge. They're also leveraging the research to enact change in their institutions to facilitate improved experiences for them and students to come after them. So this is what is the beauty of this work, is that it's a culturally sensitive research practice. It enables us to center the students and their experience as real and truth. And that is critical and will be critical as we get into the data. All right, so typically people will call them focus groups. We don't call them focus groups, we call them family reunions. We call them family reunions because, as I said, we started the study with making contact with about 60 Black graduate students in engineering institutions across the country. When the murder of George Floyd happened, sometime soon after that, we realized that we needed to just convene and check in and create a space where people could come together and share, vent, just have a space. And so we created that, and we made several different opportunities for students to come. We accommodated a range of schedules. We had family reunions in the early AM. We had family reunions late at night. We had people in countries abroad joining the family reunion. And so it showed how important it was to have this space at this time. We encouraged snowball recruitment for this because we wanted students to just have a space where they could be seen. And so if students had friends at their institution that could have used this sort of virtual counter space, then we encouraged that. So we had students from historically white institutions. I've changed that from predominantly white because we know they're predominantly white. I learned that from James, actually. HBCUs, and one participant was actually at an international institution. Uh-oh, I'm going far here. Okay. And so also we think it's interesting because so we don't call them participants, we call them members. They are community members. We don't call it focus groups, we call them family reunions. And so I will use that terminology throughout, just so you know. And the interesting part is, for participating in our studies, the members always say, I'm just so glad to have this space. I don't feel right taking the money, but we urge, and it'll come through in the data, how important it is to recognize and compensate students for their time. And so we do that. So every time we have a touch point with the members, we pay them $100, whether we talk to them for 5 minutes or 50 minutes. That's the least we could do. But we've been told by our members that this is a space that they feel like they're being empowered from, developing agency through. And so for them, that is also compensation, or that I guess offsets their desire for compensation. So in terms of the analytical approach, we started with in vivo coding. That was the first cycle. It's really important to get the meaning units from the words of the students. We then sort of tried to start putting together ideas that that were related in a pattern coding. And then at the end, once we really done a meaning making of that data with the members, we reflected and interpreted and thought about how this could be used or superimposed with chat to identify the community's needs and the opportunities for the institution to better position, better prepare those players in the in that model that I showed you to better achieve the ultimate goal. Okay, a little bit about our researcher positionality. 3 of the researchers were Black, and at the intersection of other marginalized identity. 1 of my postdoc is international. 3 of the researchers are engineers. 2 of the researchers shared the role identity with the members because they are also Black graduate students in engineering. And so it was interesting to see some of the overlap that they had with some of the community members, but that also was differentiated because they had me as their advisor. And we actually had the shared identity during this critical time. And out of our 11 members listed in the table, none had an advisor that shared their identity. There were 2 that had a team of advisors, but their primary advisor did not share their identity. And so that actually played into the way that students felt seen and supported through this time. And the other was that there was an insight to the power dynamics and challenges that Black graduate students have, being that at one point I was also a Black graduate student in engineering. And sadly, the experiences haven't changed much. And if anything, they have seemingly become more intense, more painful, and more residual. Less people are less able to come back, if you will. So how I'm going to present this, I will try to go through fast. There are a lot of excerpts here that I want to share. I've minimized them to focus on challenges, responses, and then accommodations and actions. So we'll see that for both COVID, and we'll see that for Racism 20. And then at the end, I'll try to put these 2 together so that we can see the larger picture that's created, and then maybe have time for some discussion about what that means and where that leaves us. Okay, so the first one, so the challenges around COVID were transitioning from in-person to virtual, expectations of productivity, progress delays, and isolation. So this one talks about equipment needs and uncertainty. And it said, and for my research, I don't have the right equipment to do research from home, so I need a special computer so I don't crash this computer trying to run code. So they were just like, okay, that's a justified reason. We're going to have to figure something out, find more funds. And I'm like, am I going to have to find more funds? So then we're back at the top of the roller coaster again, like, wow, so how's this going to work? And then they found money for it. I'm like, I can't keep going through this. My heart can't take it. So that's how it was working for me. It was just a constant roller coaster ride. So think about the fact that the student here is internalizing, not knowing initially how this equipment that's needed for them to work successfully from home is going to be obtained, and actually being emotionally connected and perturbed around waiting for the resolution to that. In terms of expectations of productivity, this one is talking about pressure from an advisor. And this person said that they felt like they had experienced 3 pandemics, and with the third one being qualifying for their candidacy. It says, so not only was I doing regular coursework because it's a requirement for my funding to be full-time, I also had to study for a qualifying exam that the professor really wanted to be in person during the pandemic. So we have a constant back and forth, me and the professor. I'm even having doctor's notes because I'm a high-risk person. And I was just like, we shouldn't be arguing 2 weeks before the exam. So that whole thing was stressful for the person. So in this case, there's added stress from an advisor to be in person, despite the person being high risk. So think about here, they have a task at hand, passing their candidacy. They're doing their graduate work. And also there are these other things, COVID in the background that's potentially jeopardizing their own health. And how are they balancing all of that? And how is the advisor thinking about that if the expectation is still to focus on productivity over safety? Okay, working more. So this one talks about keeping the graduate school open. And it says that the person didn't, the funding doesn't stop, so the work keeps going, like it's just expected to continue. And the advisor had already called at any time, but now they called more. And I think the point here that is really resonates with me is the individual said it was kind of less of a working day and you're just working, period. And so thinking about that shift and moving to online and what that meant for people that were that were experiencing this intersection of pandemics. Okay, moving to progress delays. So progress was access dependent. So, but within that time, I was trying to get data for my candidacy proposal. So that was an issue. This person needed microscopes, but they couldn't get the microscopes without training. There was no training because you couldn't be in person. And so that was a significant issue that the person had to deal with. Not being able to progress and the associated mental anguish of that might have been something that wasn't taken into account to the fullest extent in terms of how it impacted students' ability to just keep showing up with enthusiasm and prioritizing the work. And lastly, as it related to COVID, there were challenges around isolation. And so this one is talking about just a student that had a fear of infecting their family. And so it said, you know, it's like if I come home and then my parents died because I came back because I wanted to be home, just felt like that was too crazy for anybody to take. So I've been kind of away for the most part from family and stuff. So that's been kind of wild. And so this is just talking about people being isolated from their family, the sources that normally would help them get through critical times. They were disconnected by the isolation induced from the pandemic. And this one is just talking about those daily interactions. Then I started recognizing the lack of being able to go see people I want to see. Those daily interactions, I just started appreciating them more. And so for me, that was a struggle. Okay, so these are some of the experiences around COVID, isolation due to fear, isolation due to just the isolation causing an appreciation for these daily interactions. So now let's think about, or let's see some of the responses. And so how these responses are disaggregated, we will focus on excerpts that represent student level responses, advisor level responses, and departmental responses. Okay, so for students, this is just talking about COVID. And this particular student initially was happy, right? Because they consider themselves an introvert and were excited about being able to isolate. But it said, obviously, after a while, even for this person, it kind of got old. The advisor, so for me, it was just stressful because initially that's the thought that I had. My department is saying, graduate students, you still have to do what you're supposed to do. Y'all still have responsibilities. I'm just like, but I'm not going to campus. So how's that going to work? And then my advisor stepped in and they were like, y'all are not going, just do whatever you need to do. And so that alleviated my stress entirely. And so what's important here is to see that some advisors leverage their power to support student needs and prioritize or center the student. But that was not the case across all student experiences. And in terms of the department, they said during that period, the department was really silent the whole time. But they would say, well, we follow what the school is saying. If the president of the school said something, then it's like, yeah, we'll follow what they're saying. So this established the department to sort of follow the precedent of the top down of the institution. So if the expectation was, okay, students are coming back to campus, then that's what the department would say. And so we'll see how that shows up a little bit differently when we move into Racism 20. So now to just share some of the excerpts from Racism 20, the challenges as associated with racism, the systemic racism pandemic, was the burden of representation, hypervisibility and invisibility, mental health and wellness, and then again, we see isolation. So in terms of the burden of representation, this is a long one, but I'll summarize what it's saying here. So there was a student that had been awarded a fellowship, and during the time that they had the fellowship, the institution didn't have to pay for them because they received their own fellowship. Then during the time of the pandemics, the student needed coverage for a 3-month period. And the institution was, excuse me, giving difficulty around how the student would get funded. And then it turned around that they came up with a solution, or the money came from somewhere, and the student was informed that they would be supported. But then with that, they also got a request to be on a panel. And so it says, and so I had to do that to get funding. But we had recruitment weekend last week, and the night before a panel, they asked me to be on a panel. And I said, can you send me a list of the students who are coming? And on there, as I expected, there's one Black girl who was looking at the school, and they probably wanted me on the panel to try to win her over. I was the last Black student admitted, and I came in 2015. So it's like, you're showing me you don't really care, but you still want my labor and everything. So that's my institution. Okay, so this is how, on one hand, a student it can be unresolved how a student is going to get paid or not even be a priority, but then the institution can turn around and ask that same student to recruit a student just days later. Compensation for efforts and unfulfilled promises. I remember I applauded my graduate school for this, because when they first asked me to be on a council, they said, yeah, we understand the burden of representation that you've told us about. So everybody that's on this council will get a stipend of this much. But that was in the first email, and I haven't heard anything about that since. And so students are continuously in this time period being tasked with serving on committees, serving on task forces, writing recommendations or providing recommendations, and yet not being compensated for their time. Hypervisibility and invisibility. So there was a lack of support and understanding in general. This one said, at least for me, it was the idea that I was in a space where I felt like I had to shut off. Anything that was going on outside of that space, I had to shut off. There was nobody in that space that I felt was truly a support system for what I was going through, or truly understood, or really even, I guess, strong to say, would even care to understand. But it was just kind of hard for me dealing in that space. And I could tell that fairly specifically, I know within my group, because it's a small group, I could tell that they were very uncomfortable with it. And so it was just like, well, since we're uncomfortable with it, we'll just kind of not address it or talk about it. Now, this to me is very alarming when we consider the fact that most of these students have already identified the fact that they were either the only Black in their lab group, if not the only Black student in their department. And so if there's no one or place where they can feel support, or at least the belief that support is there, or even the interest to be supportive, that can definitely demonstrate something problematic. Again, feeling exploited, where they put Black students on display to attract more Black students, or we put Black faculty on display to attract more Black faculty without an intention to really correct the issues that we have and are aware of. So this is talking about, it's a lack of appreciation, a lack of value, it's outward facing, it's performative. We're working on a paper right now called Black Magnets that talks about this very thing, because it came up in the data so much. Black students is dismay with feeling like, they have to recruit, but not feeling ethically right about recruiting people into a space that they know is not supportive. And so having to juggle that dilemma with the potential for it to be punitive, right? There's power dynamics at play. These people will sign on their degree. These people control their funding. And so there's a lot embedded in that we need to think about from the institutional view. This one talks about there being a different set of rules. It says, it causes a lot of internal conflict, which weighs on you. And that's brain power that you could be using to work on your PhD or live your life. And the white guys in the lab, they're never approached to do these talks or these outreach events or any of this. So they're just not thinking about it. And if you go down to the bottom, it says if they didn't have their scholarship program, I think I would have just dropped out because it's just not good for women or people of color. But if you're, in my experience, if you're a guy, that's not even a thought process. So this is talking about how students are navigating, thinking that there are two different sets of rules almost for them and for majority students. Mental health and wellness, that was talking about the toll of doing their work and the work. And so that means they're here to be graduate students, but then they're also being tasked with this additional work as the representative or to inform these committees or task forces. And it says the effects of it are emotional and psychological, and they affect our work as anything like that does. So it is unfair to assume that the students will be able to hold up that pillar, especially your students from underrepresented groups. And lastly, we'll talk about isolation. There was a physical emotional presence, and it said for this particular member, it just hit them the hardest that they couldn't reach out to touch somebody in the time that was the hardest. And so it said, and so I guess in that way, the second pandemic that happened was the thing that hit me the hardest. So second pandemic being racism 20, but it was exacerbated by the fact that I couldn't even, by the first pandemic, by the fact that everyone was now socially distanced, by the fact that now everybody you can't really be physically present for each other. And so that, I guess that was the hardest. When we think about the responses at the student level, it's very important to understand how students experience this duality. So this particular student is having a resonance with George Floyd. It says, but then I was able to express George Floyd was a tall, relatively large Black man, right? Any situation, going out to the store, like grocery store, coming out of the grocery store, that's a very common space to be in. And I identified as George Floyd. I could have been that person because I am also a tall, large Black man. And so to think about this, and he ends saying, I can easily see myself in this position. That duality, that reality does not go away. And so students are simultaneously navigating that in life and in their academic spaces. So if we treat all students the same, when we have students that are having very unique experiences, terrified to drive in their cars for fear of getting pulled over by police and maybe not making it to their destination. These are things that we cannot ignore, and to not explicitly bring attention to them is to ignore them. Okay, advisor. So my one Black advisor has just been reaching out to us. This is one of the members that has a team approach advisor, but this was not their primary advisor. Especially with what happened with George Floyd, anything that's been happening in the media to Black people, my one advisor just sends us a text message and it's like, hey, we all need to come up with a meeting where we can meet as a group and then one-on-one, because I really just want to check to make sure that you guys are okay, do what we need to make you feel a little better, putting your research on the back burner because you're a person first. So this is a very intentional message to get from an advisor. This advisor, in just doing this, was creating a culture. What type of cultures have we facilitated in our own spaces? Were we intentional to explicitly promote students prioritizing themselves, or did we not promote anything, right? This goes back to change agent, change willing, change averse, change indifferent. And so in terms of the department, this is one of the perspectives that arose, and then there was great shared sentiment around this, which represented similar actions across multiple institutions. I really don't recall them making an urgent matter about the rights of Black people as fast as they sent out that email about hate on Asians. None of it's right. I'm not even saying that, but I just felt as though like that email got sent out really quickly by my department. Instead of them tackling the issues of diversity and inclusion surrounding the Black people in our department, when it came down to the rights and having the conversation, I don't think we did that. We didn't have this attention from my department. Okay, so context and framing matter, right? Perception is informed by one's reality. These students feel invisible, and that's what they're saying. It's not a priority to the department. Their experience is not a priority to the department. So how might such impact sense of belonging or a student's desire to stay? And this is just to summarize two of the additional realms that came up. So performative actions, it says in general, I'm very upset that it went the way it did, but I'm not surprised at the same time. I think the biggest things that I remember were different people of power inside the institution sending out letters of supposed comfort and understanding to broadcast out about what's happening in the world. It really didn't hit home. It did not register with anyone in the Black community. And so this aligns with the work that Dr. James Holly and I, Jr. and I are doing with these statements, because that has been true in the data, is that these statements have not landed with the audience that they were created to center, to support, and to serve. So these actions were taken to be performative at best. And that's problematic when you couple that with the student level of advocacy and activism that happened. Students really took the brunt of responding, of developing a list of accommodations, of working to get change and bringing these things to their institution. It says, because it became a ongoing conversation as a group and other groups, we decided to do something about it and say, we need these accommodations because of these two pandemics. We can't have this effective attention of your already small Black population in the school. So this particular group has actually made a lot of impact in their environment and are having other institutions meet those efforts, but it's led from the bottom up by students. So as I kind of want to bring everything in together and just summarize, we had COVID-19 and we had racism 20, and we had Black graduate students in engineering experiencing them both simultaneously. When we think about the perceptions of the responses, in terms of COVID-19, they were intentional, they were proactive. Yet when it came to racism 20, they were performative and delayed. When we think about the accommodations made in COVID-19, there were extended years in the program. So, some institutions gave students an extra year of funding, equipment needs were provided for. When it came to racism 20, there were letters drafted or sent, there were emails, there were statements of solidarity, there were establishment of diversity fellowships. The real-time nature of those accommodations are almost strikingly different. And why? So the action drivers, who was leading, right? COVID-19 was very institution, top down, departments were mirroring the institution. Racism 20, silence. People weren't saying anything. Students were having to share their feelings or, relive or live through their pain to give voice to their pain so that they could be seen. And so that was a bottom-up approach. In terms of implementation, for COVID-19, things were actionable, right? For racism 20, things were prescriptive, what we will do, what we can do. For COVID-19, things happen. So I do that and I come back to a reflection. These collective experiences of Black engineering students inform, what do these inform about engineering's awareness, understanding, and support of their unique experiences, and in particular, while navigating at the intersection of two pandemics? I'll let you sit on that for a second. As you think about that, let's come back to this. How are Black students experiencing the engineering culture? What's the messaging we're given, right? So I asked in the beginning, if you considered yourself a change agent, change willing, change averse, or change indifferent. And I've created this maybe typology, if you will, with this separation, this dashed line as making this binary. So, and these are my words, this is my belief, and this is supported by the work that I have been able to create with these students. Any effort that is to the right of being a change agent is to continue to perpetuate systemic racism, okay? So change agent, if we are not a change agent, by the definition of what it means to be anti-racist, that means we're not in action. If we're not in action, we are promoting racism. To be critically conscious is to be acting to dismantle these systems of injustice. And so we all need to position ourselves to move from indifferent to averse and willing to being an agent. And so I have some more, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to move to take questions. One thing before I do take questions, I just want to put these implications out because I think that's critically important. And if I have a chance, I can come back and make the connection to chat. I just don't want to. I just don't want to run out of time. Silence is not an option. Immediate versus delayed responses matter. Responses must be consistent, meaningful, and informed by and grounded in the vantage of the target. When we make actions, whether intentional or otherwise, there is impact, and students make meaning of those actions. Majority faculty prioritizing their own discomfort, we need tools. We need tools to develop culturally sensitive approaches in our teaching, in our research, and our service. We need cultural competence embedded across these things that enable us to actually work to be change agents. Students initiating their own supports, students need resources. Students should be able to just be students and do their work and do the task of being a graduate student. It should not be the onus put on graduate students to change the culture, to even bring recognition and awareness to these changes. That is our institutional responsibility, and we must be accountable. And mental health is real and cannot be ignored. And so this quote is really important. Our evidence supports that many chronic workplace stress result in organizations that are chronically hyper-aroused, have lost the capacity to manage emotions institutionally, and as a result, fail to learn from experience. In this way, our organization can develop learning disabilities accompanied by organizational amnesia. Under such circumstances, the most emotionally charged information becomes undiscussable, and organizations develop alexithymia, Leaders are likely to become more authoritarian and punitive. Workers respond with more aggressive and passive aggressive behavior, and the entire environment becomes progressively more violent and unjust. Despite this apparent deterioration, the likelihood is that chronically stressed organizations will simply continue to repeat the past, engaging in reenactment, and as a result, steadily deteriorating. May we resist deterioration. So with that, I will really close and take questions. Thank you.
We do have one question in the Q&A. If you're, Brooke, are you able to see that, or I can read it to you if you want?
Let's see. I don't see it. Can you read it to me?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a Q&A. I don't know if there's a Q&A button at the bottom, but I'll read it. So it says,
oh, okay, I do see. Okay, I got you.
Okay, yep.
Okay, so the question is, how do you balance mental bandwidth to be technically competent, to be someone who will be listened to and being a change agent now instead of later? I struggle with what I should be doing and seeking out now. I think that's a great question. And I think that it starts with self. All efforts start with self. And so if we are able to do self-assessment, that's one of the core competencies required to develop cultural competence. And cultural competence is a part, it's necessary to help us position ourselves to actually be change agents. So I think, how do we balance? We do what you're doing now. We ask difficult questions. We have voice. We put ourselves in environments to learn, to grow, to gain awareness of others' experiences. And we just develop a critical consciousness. It's not, you don't have to be marginalized to be critical and conscious. And so I think the mental bandwidth, it's hard. It's a struggle. So that, I mean, that doesn't go away. It's not easy, but it's necessary. And so I think we all have to push beyond our own comforts and roll our sleeves up to do the work that's needed to be done. Thank you for the question. Okay, I see another question. As a white graduate student, how can I have conversations with white faculty to help them see and change from a change willing to change agent, especially seeing how their good intentions can be harmful for people of color or students of color? Wow, that's a great question. And so I think, how can we have conversations to make people change from willing to change agent? So I think that goes deep into our historical perception of what racism is. And I say that because I think we have a couple of misconceptions that we actually operate around. One being that racism is something that happens out there in the world and not here in academia, right? So that's myth number one. Racism is alive and well societally and in our academic environments. So there needs to be recognition and ownership of that. The second thing is, we have had the misconception that racism is like grandiose gestures, overt actions that happen, and that we can point to and say, that was racist, that was racist. When in fact, to have any level of awareness that systemic racism exists, to think about how it manifests in our academic environments, from the visibility of people through the policies that we have, the tenure and promotion process, what's recognized in those efforts, what things are valued in engineering culture. It's systemic and pervasive throughout. So one thing that we have to do is help people understand that it's not only the grandiose actions that count, it's the lack of action that also counts. And I think if we start to project inaction as racism as a message, maybe that can help people be catalyzed to do what we all need to do. This is not a Black people issue or a brown people issue. This is an everyone issue. And until we all take it into our consciousness to act towards change, it will be very difficult to work towards actually creating anti-racist environments, inclusive environments, environments that are liberating for all people. So thank you for that question. I hope I addressed it.
I want to point out there's a question in the chat as well.
Madison, when you said, what stakes would you consider BIPOC having in aiding folks to go from change willing to change agent? Are you, I just want clarity on the question. Are you asking sort of at what consequence might it come to promote people to go from willing to agent? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm asking.
Okay, great. So this is a great question because it speaks to what has been established as our culture, right? There should not be stakes for speaking up or aiding people to shift from being willing to an agent. But I know that can be true. I think there are inevitably things associated with the power dynamic. For example, if a graduate student, so in our work, we have many graduate students that have non-Black advisors. And so when they are sharing of their experience, it can be received as something different than an intent just to share their experience. So it could come with backlash. It could come with a punitive measure. It could come with retaliation. That is possible. I think what we have to do is move towards institutions having policies that support this notion where it's almost, this is ideal, but moving towards having to be an agent, like willing not being an option, or indifferent, definitely not being an option, averse not being an option, but agents. And maybe that comes from rethinking about who we hire as faculty, or how we require people to be culturally competent. Is that a requirement? What is the training? How are faculty having to demonstrate an ability that they can engage in a safe way with all students, and not leaving it on the people to have to speak up in those realms, because everything is sort of like on a case-by-case basis. I could tell you that I'm an assistant professor, as a tenure track faculty, there are many people that would caution me against doing this work for the penalty of it being counter to your pursuit of tenure. And that to me is just where the value system comes in, because without this work, I can't persist in an environment, because I see that change is needed. And so I have to be a part of that change. So it just depends on the person. It could come with, different repercussions, but it should not be. And that's up to our institutions to change that framing. That's up to engineering to shift our culture, where it's not punitive to expect respect and to be welcome in an environment. So thank you for that question, Madison. And then I have a question in the Q&A that says, have you seen any differences in the experiences of students from historically white institutions versus historically Black colleges and universities? That is a great question. Thank you for that, Corinne. The reason I think that's a great question is because typically we think that students that are at HBCUs we might anticipate that they will have a better experience, but it's interesting because not all of the students at HBCUs are being advised by Black faculty. Many still have non-Black faculty in engineering. So the difference is they have a critical mass of Black students at the university, but they might still have professors that are that don't share their identity. So it's, though there's a different type of the experience is different, but they are students at HBCUs are not without challenges. So in this particular focus, in these family reunions, all of these students were from historically white institutions. We do have students from historically Black colleges and universities in the study. And it's been interesting to see, maybe not so much as it relates to systemic racism and COVID. I think systematically the mechanisms of isolation were shared, independent of where the student, what institutions the students were attending, because students that were in HBCUs, they were isolated and away from their critical mass, even though their institution had the critical mass. So the isolation sort of fostered the same, a shared experience across them, which is why we were even able to take that phenomenological perspective. Any other questions?
If you want, Dr. Coley, sometimes we stop the recording and let everyone kind of join the meeting. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.